Hi there, this is IELTS Breakthrough YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about micro skill number 3. Do you know what that is? Well, that's all about making comparisons. This is the second video in the series on micro skill number 3 because making comparisons is a very flexible area in English, and there are some different structures that you need to know to help you do this effectively. Now, just to remind you that if you are taking the academic version of IELTS and you want to be able to answer the task 1 writing question, that is describing charts of different kinds, then you need to make comparisons, and this video is going to be really helpful for you. So make sure you watch through to the end and get all the tips and tricks. If you are new to the IELTS Breakthrough channel, thank you so much for clicking on this one. IELTS Breakthrough helps you to get a high score in IELTS so that you can study at an international university and or progress in your career. IELTS Breakthrough has valuable tutorials completely free on YouTube for life skills, IELTS general training, and of course IELTS Academic. So make sure that you subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you do not miss any of these free tutorials. Now, you might be asking, okay, what is this kind of comparison structure I'm going to talk about? So today we're going to look at comparisons that use not as plus the adjective. This is the second structure you can use after regular comparisons. And by the way, make sure that you do check out the video I have on writing regular comparisons as well. So let's give you an example of how the structure works. This is the basic format. X is not as high as Y. And the adjective here could be simple adjectives like high, low, big, or small. And then the X and the Y will be the variable. Once we add the variable in, you can see that we have quite a complex structure. Here are a couple of examples of a full comparison sentence using this pattern. The number of people who visited Edinburgh is not as high as the number of people who visited London. The amount of time spent in traffic by commuters in Jakarta is not as long as the amount of time spent in traffic by commuters in Singapore. Now, just to remind you that a big part of a comparison sentence is getting the variable right. I'm not going to talk about variables. By variables, I mean the number of people who visited Edinburgh, the number of people who visited London. I have a separate video on this. Make sure that you check that out if you want to know more about the variables. Here, with not as, it's basically quite a simple structure. Remember, you need your to be, which is usually is, not, and then your adjective, and then as. The adjectives will generally be simple. You can keep it to easy words like high, low, big, or small. And a couple more tips in using this structure. The first tip, just like we talked about with regular comparisons, is to make sure that you tell the reader where you have a big difference or a small difference. Now, in this structure, it can get quite complex doing this. I'd like to just suggest two simple ways, and that is by using nearly and quite. So these words, these adverbs come in after not. Is not nearly as high as. Is not quite as big as. With nearly, not nearly, then you are telling the reader there is a big difference between X and Y. And then with not quite as, you're telling the reader that there is a small difference. Let's just plug these words into the example sentences. The number of people who visited Edinburgh is not nearly as high as the number of people who visited London. By the way, that sentence is probably factually incorrect. I must admit, I don't know. I didn't check up tourist numbers for each of these cities. I'm just using this as an example to illustrate the comparison structure. And then with the traffic in commuters examples, we could write the amount of time spent in traffic by commuters in Jakarta is not nearly as long as the amount of time spent by commuters in traffic in Singapore. And then the second tip is to use that of to avoid repetition. This is done in exactly the same way as when you are writing using the regular comparison structure. You just look at variable y, see which words are repeated, and replace it with that of. So, if you have the original statement, the number of people who visited Edinburgh is not as high as the number of people who visited London, you can see the repetition relates to the number of people who visited. So we can write, the number of people who visited Edinburgh is not as high as that of London. It's easy and it makes your writing that much more sophisticated. I'll just do the second example as well because there's lots of repetition in there. The amount of time spent in traffic by commuters in Singapore is not as long as that of Jakarta. And that's really all you need to know about this particular structure. However, a couple of points that you do need to note. Make sure that your description is accurate. Sometimes it's easy to make a mistake and you use the structure correctly, but what you have written does not match the actual data on the graph. This is because you can exchange not as high as with not as low as. And if you do that, then you have to make sure that variable x and variable y are correct. What I mean is there is a difference between writing the amount of people who visited Edinburgh is not as high as the amount of people who visited London, and the amount of people who visited Edinburgh is not as low as the number of people who visited London. If you change high and low, then your description of the data completely changes. So just check the accuracy there. And then the other thing is to make sure that you practice writing out these structures before you do the test. There are 3 levels of practice here. The first level is to just copy some comparison structures that use is not as high as, and so on. Copy each one out 4 or 5 times just so that you get this structure in your head. Once you feel that you are confident working with them, then also the second level is to try and do some error corrections. And in fact, I've got a link in down below, a little exercise for you where you can pick out which sentences are right, which sentences are wrong. That will help you with your grammar awareness when you are writing these. And remember, it's not just making it right in a grammatical way. You need to make sure that the sentence is right in a factual way. And then lastly, try writing out the sentences from prompts. That would be level 3, where you actually try and write out some of your own comparison sentences. Once again, I'll put an exercise link below where you can practice these. It's completely free. Just have a go and improve your ability in task 1. So let me know in the comments, do you have any questions about how to use is not as high as, X is not as high as Y? Do you find it easy? What else would you like to know about making comparisons in this way? It would be great to hear from you in the comments. And then also make sure that you do check out the other videos. I have videos on Micro Skill 1, Micro Skill 2, and with Micro Skill 3, the first structure using regular comparisons. Check those out as well. In the meantime, thanks for staying with me. Have a great day, week, afternoon, morning. I'll see you in the next video.